Today, we'll talk a little about the wisdom of Egypt. Of course, what we're going to do is approximately a 50-minute lecture, so I hope to be concise and succinct enough to convey an idea to you. To speak about the Hermetic laws in 50 minutes is something of a marvel, because it's a subject one could talk about for an entire lifetime. It's interesting that I remember, many years ago, when I first began to study philosophy and had heard about these Hermetic laws, it was said that Hermes Trismegistus, who was a great Egyptian sage, intended to explain the entire functioning of the universe through these laws. Honestly, I imagined it would be an encyclopedia. Because the entire functioning of the universe, in fact, is summed up in just 7 very short phrases. And obviously, since we're dealing with such short phrases, their meanings are very profound. There's a direct relationship, a clue. It doesn't mean it's always accurate, but I've often found it to be true. You'll notice that the great sages of the past often had a level of wisdom proportional to their ability to synthesize ideas. In general, they spoke very little, yet conveyed a great deal. In contrast to some authors often more modern and not quite as wise who speak a lot, but when you try to distill their message, it amounts to almost nothing. So, there's no way we can exhaust, or even come close to exhausting, the Hermetic maxims in a 50-minute lecture. That's obvious. We're going to offer you an initial perspective, a first approach, so that you can grasp just how vast the knowledge yet to be discovered truly is. Everyone knows that famous phrase by Socrates, the Greek philosopher. He said, "All I know is that I know nothing." We often think of that as something, well, amusing. What does that even mean? To say that with honesty, all I know is that I know nothing, requires great wisdom. In general, our arrogance, our vanity, makes us believe we know a great deal. To be able to say, all I know is that I know nothing, you must have some sense of the vastness of what there is to know, and it is no small amount. And to say that with true understanding implies that you've glimpsed the immense universe of things yet to be known. Each time I discover a new author, each time I catch a glimpse of a new aspect of traditional philosophy, I'm struck by how much there is to learn. And more, we come to realize just how little we truly know. So, this glimpse is what we aim to offer today. To speak a little, well, essentially, about Hermes Trismegistus. This figure is the Egyptian god Thoth, who is essentially the deification of Hermes Trismegistus. This is very common across various traditions. That a being who was deeply impactful, truly special, is later included in the pantheon. India, in fact, is quite interesting in this regard, because India and Egypt share a certain similarity in the sense that they are civilizations filled with gods, where everything is considered sacred. And among all these divinities, there are many beings who serve as intermediaries between the gods and human beings, but of a very high level. The Indian rishis are like that as well. Rishis are human beings who are almost divine. In other words, within their pantheon, they envision a continuum from man to God. So, well, learn a little about this Hermes Trismegistus. Very little, in fact. Because if you look at it from a historical perspective, today, most historians believe that he may not have even existed. That name may have been a generic term for several individuals. Priests, various hierophants, various sages. I believe the name is generic, because that is very common. This happens everywhere. The name doesn't belong to a single figure, it refers to a series of them. But even so, I still believe that he existed. Because of something very simple, a very simple Western, Christian principle of ours, which, to me, makes this very clear. By their works, you shall know them. It's a historical impact far too great to have come from nothing. For someone to leave behind something that impacted the history of humanity as deeply as Ernst and Trismegistus did, they must have been a person of great stature. Major historical revolutions are not born from no one, from nothing, or from a mere compilation of opinions. A person is as great as the legacy they leave in the world. It's very hard for someone to tell me that so many extraordinary works. Lao Tzu is another one who is often questioned, that so many remarkable works, like those of Lao Tzu, that Taoism came from nothing. Iona. That the Tao Te Ching came from nowhere. No, it must have been a man as great as the work itself. because not just any person could conceive something so complex, so delicate, and so profound. So, particularly from a philosophical point of view, the two things are not mutually exclusive. There must have been many Hermes Trismegistus figures, because it's a generic name. Trismegistus means thrice initiated, or thrice wise. But there must also have been one who was the great master. Today, we speak about something that is very closed off. It is hermetically sealed. Interestingly, that term comes from the Hermetic mysteries. Because he was so careful with his knowledge, it is said that he only passed it on strictly to those who had a solid moral foundation to carry it. This is the kind of thing that, today, is difficult for us to understand, with our somewhat intellectual vanity. It seems like a restriction of knowledge. Plato already spoke about this. That absolute ignorance is better than knowledge in the wrong hands. Knowledge requires a moral foundation that ensures how you will use it. The Hermetic tradition has a very famous phrase that says, "The lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding." So, it is knowledge truly passed on from mouth to ear, from master to disciple. As for Hermes Trismegistus, we can't even speak about a specific date, because there is no consensus, not even if he even existed, let alone the date. Now, there's an interesting fact that was often discussed during the Renaissance. For those familiar with some Italian Renaissance cathedrals, you'll notice that the figure of Hermes Trismegistus occasionally appears within these cathedrals. In fact, sometimes even earlier, because there was a strong connection between medieval alchemy and Hermeticism. And typically, cathedral builders were alchemists. It's known as royal architecture, sacred architecture. They were alchemists, and all of them held the figure of Hermes Trismegistus in high regard. In fact, through my own research, I've found at least 3 stained glass illustrations in Christian cathedrals depicting Hermes Trismegistus. And one of them, in particular, located in Italy, shows him in dialogue with Moses. I'm not exactly sure what source this is based on, but it was said that he might have been Moses' teacher. Whether there's any truth to that, I couldn't say. But the approximate dating given for Moses is 1,250 years before Trismegistus. So, if there was such a historical figure, which I believe there was, perhaps it was around that time. 1,250 years before Trismegistus. It's an interesting point, because if you think about it, during that entire period, even the Egyptians themselves didn't have any works by Hermes Trismegistus. None at all. It seems that this knowledge was reserved and passed down in a very secretive manner. Until, when the Christian period begins right at the start of the transition into the Middle Ages, something from the Hermetic tradition starts to appear, for reasons unknown. Above all, 2 things that we'll explore. One is a collection of Hermetic texts known as the Hermetic corpus, which began to circulate very secretly throughout Europe around the 1st or 2nd century. Curious, isn't it? Where was all of this before? If you consider the year 1250, that's more than 100 years after Trismegistus, right? What does that amount to? 14 centuries? And even later, there's another material we'll be looking at. In just a moment, we'll talk about what's known as the Emerald Tablet. That one began to be known around the 7th century, sometime in the 600s. So this is quite interesting, everyone. Let me share something with you that I believe many of you may have already heard about. The medieval alchemists were Hermeticists. You know that story we often come across, sometimes even portrayed a bit in children's literature? It gave rise, in part, to the imagery surrounding the great Merlin, those wizards with pointed hats covered in stars, working in strange laboratories, trying to turn lead into gold. That image was likely created by the alchemists themselves. Why? To escape the Inquisition. Help me out, Renata. Would you like to add something here? Why? For obvious reasons. Turning lead into gold. That wouldn't get you burned at the stake. Ambition was something perfectly acceptable. But the pursuit of Egyptian wisdom was unforgivable. So, Hermeticism had to be hidden beneath the appearance of studies that were, let's say, scientific or physical fields that didn't pose much of a problem or face much resistance. So, you'll see that the lead they wanted to turn into gold was the lead of ignorance into the gold of wisdom. For those who are somewhat familiar with the topic, I even have a lecture on this. If you're curious, it's on YouTube. You should know that all of our lectures are available for free on YouTube. I have a lecture on medieval alchemy, a subject I'm very fond of. You'll see that they were all rooted in Hermeticism. They were Hermeticists, and this knowledge began to flourish in Europe around the beginning of the Middle Ages, and it truly blossomed during the Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino, just imagine the boldness. One of the first books he translated was precisely the Corpus Hermeticum. He brought it to light and made the Corpus Hermeticum known. It was a very bold move. The so-called Platonic Academy of Florence, in addition to being Platonic, was also Hermetic. So much of what was brought from Constantinople, Byzantium, there was a strong connection during the time of the Ottoman Turkish invasion. Much of what came from there was Hermeticism, because what had been forgotten in the West was still alive in the Middle East. So, there were several sources that brought to light, through alchemy itself and through direct contact with the Middle East, Egyptian Hermeticism. We can say that the Kybalion is an extract of Bothoff Hermetic texts and, above all, of the Emerald Tablet, a great deal from the Emerald Tablet. It's a very short text, from which the 7 fundamental laws of the organization of the universe were extracted and synthesized. Quite ambitious, isn't it? 7 fundamental laws of organization of what, you ask? Of everything you can possibly imagine. Hermes Trismegistus says, with these 7 laws, you will know all that can be known. Obviously, there must be many, 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 many keys hidden within. Helena Blavatsky, a brilliant thinker of the 19th century, used to say, a true myth has at least 7 doors, 7 keys. And you realize this, which is something truly fascinating, my friends. Take a highly symbolic book and read it now. Then mark the date, your moment in life. 10 years from now, read it again. If, in the meantime, you have grown as a human being, 10 years from now it will feel like an entirely different book. I even recommend keeping the same copy, so you don't think you're reading a different translation because the one you read didn't have that, or rather, it did, but it was marked by you. It's truly remarkable how we open doors in the world when we open doors within ourselves. The deeper within, the farther beyond. This is a rather curious principle, and one that truly holds up. So, this is our friend. This is already a much later sculpture. No one has the slightest idea what Hermes Trismegistus actually looked like. The sculpture is from the Christian era. Actually, this is a replica not from the Christian era, no, this is earlier, 5 centuries before Trismegistus, but it is a replica. A replica of what might have been a distant memory of Hermes Trismegistus. Here we also have a replica of the Emerald Tablet, which contains very enigmatic phrases. And some of the maxims from the Kybalion are found there. As I mentioned to you, in the Corpus Hermeticum, it is also said that the Egyptian Book of the Dead may have been created under the profound influence of Hermes Trismegistus. Now let's move forward. Let's understand what the Egyptian Book of the Dead really is, keeping in mind that it didn't even have that name, by the way. The Book of the Coming Forth by Day, the Book of the Hidden Chamber, wasn't a single book, but rather a collection of knowledge and precepts, mostly passed down through oral tradition, which described what happens to a person after death. Now, the Egyptians had a perspective that we can share in that view as well, because it remains deeply relevant today that the greatest affliction of humanity is forgetfulness. So, it's no use for us to know all of this. When the moment of death approaches, we tend to forget everything. Each time a person felt the need to remember, and wanted to ensure they wouldn't forget, they would commission their own Book of the Dead to be written. So, you'll notice that what we know when you look at an edition of the Book of the Dead, which, by the way, features a beautiful introduction by Carl Jung, who was very fond of this book, the Book of the Dead. It contains a series of vignettes that are a compilation of various papyri that were found with mummies, generally those of Scribesoft and of Nude, and many others. This was compiled. The stories are similar, alike, but it's not a single book. It's a compilation of those papyri that were found placed on the chests of various mummified scribes. You would have your own Book of the Dead written, to ensure that you wouldn't forget what you needed to remember before standing before the weighing of the heart of the deceased, which was the do-it. What you had to say in your negative confession. what you had to plead to your heart. To those who stood at the entrance. In fact, we have a fragment of one of those papyri, which contains that magnificent image of the weighing of the heart of the deceased. And then, when one arrived before Osiris, Isis, and Nephthys, and the 72 judges of Amenti, and so on. A complex story. Complex, with many, many, many details. And after that, what happened to those who reincarnated, and to those who didn't? So, it was a reminder that each person rewrote for themselves. Because the Book of the Dead itself, as a tradition just like the story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, was all part of an oral tradition. It was eventually compiled on temple walls, in papyri belonging to individuals who didn't want to forget it. Now, it is said that the one who organized the mysteries in Egypt was Hermes Trismegistus. So, this is part of the oral tradition. You may have heard, for example, drawing a parallel with India, that the Vedas, especially the Rig Veda, were only written down around the 6th century, before Trismegistus. This was something that had to be memorized by the Brahmins. In general, when there is a concern about writing down a sacred book, it's precisely because people are afraid of forgetting. They no longer trust their memory as much. They fear distorting the knowledge. So it's better to reduce it to something written than to forget everything. Because in the golden ages of those civilizations, writing down sacred books was considered a profanation. To write was a desecration. It was a reduction. The word can never fully reflect everything. And keep in mind, we're talking about a language far richer than our own. Languages today are very impoverished. Back then, it was a language. Hieroglyphs were a very rich language, capable of expressing many things that we can no longer convey. But even so, it was still considered a reduction. Well then, continuing a bit with what we call the historical journey of religious syncretism. Imagine Hermes Trismegistus, a man, a great sage, a hierophant, a priest of what were known as the mysteries, the Egyptian initiations. Don't worry, I'll explain this idea of initiation in just a moment. And the representation made of him after his death is that of an ibis. Precisely that aspect of the slender beak, capable of entering an anthill and selecting the exact ant it wants, the capacity for discernment. Intelligence comes from intelligere, choose from within, to discern, to separate the good grain, as the saying goes. This discernment, this intelligency, is the scribe of the gods, the one who would record divine laws for humanity, and always a representation of the gods. Very similar, holding the Ankh key in hand. That staff, which is the staff of Anubis, or Ash, the one who sees in the darkness, so that he could descend to humanity and transmit knowledge. Thus, this was the representation of Hermes Trismegistus as a god. Within the Egyptian tradition, it made perfect sense. Now think how interesting this is, this god, this scribe, this master of knowledge who transmits the laws of heaven to the earth. The Greeks held him in high regard. The Greeks had great respect for Egypt. Did you know that Plato traveled through Egypt? A great philosopher had to have passed through Egypt. It was a fundamental matter. But the Greeks knew that if they presented a deity with that appearance, it would mean nothing to them. Because the mindset of a Greek is much more rational than that of the Egyptian, who is far more intuitive. So, the Greek adapts the spirit of Hermes Trismegistus into a figure that would be much more understandable to the Greek mind, which is the figure of Hermes. The god who also communicates, the messenger god, who connects heaven and earth, that is our friend here. Who later becomes Mercury in Rome. The god who carries this staff or caduceus in his hand, which represents the human being itself, this caduceus. The physical, psychic, and spiritual aspects, which, when aligned, become a tool in the hand of a god of our own inner god. So, you will see that Hermes, or Mercury among the Romans, is an adaptation of Thoth to the Greco-Roman spirit. Because they understood that the Greeks had a different mindset. Notice that this alone could be the subject of an entire lecture, my friends. Why is that? Because imagine that we are incredibly rich in creations, yet we do not create our own symbols. In order to have a symbol for knowledge, for discernment, we need to use some ancient symbol. We have invented tools capable of simulating the first moments of the universe. That particle accelerator we know. which discovered the Higgs boson way, can roughly calculate the distance at which a comet will pass by Earth. We do amazing things. But have we been able to build our own symbols in a way that our society can understand them? So, we work with borrowed symbols. It's curious, isn't it? So, it's the same God who was later conveyed through an image more suited to a particular mindset. They loved the Greeks, loved the Romans, but certainly, they were not as intuitive as the Egyptians were. They were more rational, and needed something that felt more tangible to them. They wouldn't have understood a Thoth. So, it was adapted and recreated through the Orphic mindset. In Greek culture, Thoth was recreated in the form of Hermes, and later as Mercury. Well, continuing on. Also something very basic for us to understand, the Middle Ages. You know that even kings, Charlemagne for example, was illiterate. Did you know that? His scribes, his advisors, had to write his titles for him, because he could only make a scribble. And even a king actually, perhaps the greatest king of the Middle Ages, because during the Middle Ages, there were hardly any true kings didn't even know how to write his own name. Just imagine that. A good lesson. The common folk, the serfs of the realm. The only ones who knew anything at all were the clergy. Even the nobility didn't know much. So, they knew almost nothing more about Egypt. But they knew that Egypt held mysteries. That remained preserved. It echoed in such a way that even to this day, it still lingers. Every time a strange person appeared, someone they thought might be a kind of sorcerer wandering around the feudal lands, they would say, "He must be from Egypt." In other words, I don't know anything, but I know those people have something strange about them. That is, it echoed so deeply that it reaches us even today. Today, when you want to convey an idea, something a bit esoteric, I often joke with my students that we've become so superficial that we no longer truly understand what esoteric means. We have what I call the schizoteric. So, when you want to set up a little shop that looks kind of exotic, who do you turn to? To indigenous and Egyptian themes. You'll fill it with Egyptian ornaments and play Indian ragas inside. Ah, those maddening microtones they use. Wow, anyway. Because we don't know anything, but we do know that there was something different going on there. They had mysteries. This has endured throughout history and is still present in our time. Just imagine how a civilization manages to project such a powerful image across history. How great must they have been? In Cairo, they say, man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. Because it's truly impressive. They will eventually cease to exist, they're already fading, they've been heavily damaged, but look at their astonishing durability. Have you considered the amount of stone that was taken from those pyramids on the Giza Plateau to build the city of Cairo itself? And still, they couldn't destroy them. Can you imagine the willpower of a man who left behind a legacy of that magnitude? And even with great effort, people couldn't bring it down. It's astonishing. Egypt is truly astonishing. It's as if you imagine an airplane flying across the sky. You know that every airplane leaves some kind of smoke trail. But if it's a jet fighter, it's already long gone, and that streak still cuts across the sky. You look at it and say, that wasn't just any small plane, it was a jet fighter. And a man who leaves behind a trail of that magnitude, a civilization. Isn't that the mark of a great civilization? Because no matter how much people tried, they couldn't erase Egypt. Not even the image that kept echoing throughout history could be erased. So, it is the seat of the mysteries and the center of initiations. And now we'll try to understand, to the best of our ability, what these levels of knowledge we call initiations truly are. Today, it's a word that is sometimes used, it's become trendy. I'm very wary of words that become trendy. In general, they don't mean anything. I'm terribly concerned when people start picking up Eastern concepts like karma. Karma, then, has become just anything, poor thing. What a pity for karma. People are there suffering, getting beaten down, completely passive, doing nothing. Oh, it's my karma. My goodness. Any Indian sage would roll in their grave 1,000 times. Thankfully, they were cremated instead of buried. So, the concepts become very hollowed out. From time to time, people talk about this issue of de-initiations. Just another angle. Very basic, within a lecture that aims to be an hour or less. Imagine the following. Recently, you may have seen in the news that, once again, remains were found in the interior of Spain. This isn't the first time such a discovery has been reported, but this one was among the most remote. They found a site where it's likely that men from one of those ancestral hominid groups once camped. These are the kinds of things researchers are always looking for. And they found something that I found very interesting, very striking. They found stone remnants that clearly had no utilitarian purpose. They weren't for hunting, or for anything practical. It was probably a small altar. It served a ceremonial purpose. I don't know exactly which hominid it was. I don't recall the specific name, but I do know it was a being that was likely a precursor to humanity, with very limited resources. But it already knew how to recognize and symbolize, in some way, the presence of the sacred in the universe. Isn't that remarkable? Iona, that's why it's often said great thinkers tend to say that man is not Homo sapiens, but Homo religiosus. Because when it comes to being sapiens, sometimes you see a chimpanzee doing astonishing things. A gorilla, you know the difference between a chimpanzee and a human is just one chromosome can sometimes do astonishing things. So, man would be more accurately described as Homo religiosus, because you won't see a chimpanzee placing one stone on top of another and revering it, seeing through it love, justice, fraternity, in other words, God. It won't. This metaphysical awareness is uniquely human. So it is said that when the human being, at a certain point, begins to realize that nature has a level of complexity that cannot be explained solely through reason, they begin to perceive the sacred. I recommend it to you. And I will still give a lecture on this topic. An Arabic book called The Self-Taught Philosopher. It's a beautiful thing. And in this book, it tells the story of a man who was raised wild, in the forest among animals. He goes through these stages on his own, observing life, the complexity of life, and arriving at a conclusion. No, God exists. It's not possible otherwise. Impossible. He begins to perceive the laws that bring harmony to things. He begins to realize that things are not random. And he realizes, there is something beyond what I can see. There is something behind the scenes of life, something beyond the physical, something metaphysical. And he begins to symbolically represent this and to bow before it. It is said that this is a very important first stage for the human being. He begins to perceive the sacred in nature. Now God is there, and I'm here. And I recognize him and am humble before him, I bow before him. At a certain point, as the human being continues along this path, advancing in this direction, he begins to realize that the sacred is not just over there while he is over here. The sacred is both there and here. There are divine attributes within him. He sees justice in nature, but he also sees that same justice within himself. From time to time, a flash of that justice reveals itself. He sees wisdom outside, but from time to time he also sees that wisdom within. At times, he is surprised by the beauty of the ideas he is capable of having, the beauty of acts of love, the beauty of acts of fraternity. At a certain moment, he begins to realize, well, if I come to know myself deeply, could I understand a little of God? Man, know thyself, and you will know the universe and the gods. Delphi in Greece, right? This is a philosophical stage, where the search for the sacred is no longer only external, it's also within. The pursuit of self-knowledge, man as a microcosm, as Plato used to say. This quest for self-knowledge, the humanism inherent in philosophy, is already a stage. A little different. And, at a certain point, those very special and very rare individuals in humanity, this is what the Egyptians believed. Mind you, I'm a philosopher, I'm here to make claims of absolute truths, but the Egyptians believed that some of these individuals, truly exceptional, at a certain moment, it was no longer God over there and me over here, it was no longer God there and God here, there was no longer a there and a here. The human being merged with the whole, consciously. He could be in the world, yet he perceived himself as a cell of the divine. He could be in the world, but he saw himself as a digit of God. He transcended what, in Tibet, they call the heresy of separateness. I'm very fond of an Indian image, which is the image of the Sutratma. They say that all beings are like beads on a necklace, and a single thread runs through each of them. That thread is the divine, the sacred. And when you perceive your essence, you realize it is the same essence as that of the universe. And you transcend separateness. That was initiation. It is something very profound. because the human being feels like a drop of water merging into the ocean. It is a consciousness of oneself as a cell within a much greater being. This is a revolution of consciousness, far beyond what an ordinary person could attain. But it is said that, through overcoming, along a long path of philosophy, at a certain point, the human being would reach wisdom. This gives rise to a system. Like monasteries, initiatic systems. It was an acceleration of human evolution tremendous, but with a single purpose. To commit oneself to guiding humanity. The only cause had to be fraternity. A renunciation of any personal interest. So, you can see that it wasn't a system for just anyone. But it is said that there were some individuals who reached that level. And they truly attained full wisdom. These were the initiated masters. And Hermes Trismegistus is said to have been one of them. Now, just between us, Greece inherited this. Eleusis was an initiatic center. Samothrace, which even influenced Rome, was an initiatic center. It is said that Philip, father of Alexander the Great, and Olympias, his mother, met within Samothrace. The mystery of the Kybalion. In other words, this existed in many places in India, not to mention. These so-called initiatic schools endured throughout history until, at a certain point, there was no longer, let's say, a historical environment for them. For those who enjoy, for example, Christian Jack, who is a very high-level historical novelist, I really appreciate his work. One of his books talks about Philae, which was the last of the Egyptian temples, the last of the Egyptian initiatic schools that were closed. When Egypt could no longer withstand so many invaders, so much historical decline. So there comes a certain moment when it truly closes, it disappears. But in certain civilizations, this was public. In Greece, everyone knew where Eleusis was, everyone knew where Abydos was in Egypt. But when a very high level of materialism sets in, knowledge must be kept reserved, so that human ambition does not profane it. Because knowledge, when it is too much and placed in the hands of a very immature person, is like a knife in the hands of a child. It can only cause harm to the person themselves, so knowledge is kept reserved. This was a structure. And it's an interesting thing, because you'll see that in Egypt there was no word for private. You can look for it. You won't find any specific word that referred to the word religion. Do you know why? There wasn't a part of your life that was considered religion. Everything was. You see it in the culture, you see it in daily habits, you see it in agriculture. Everything was a way of reconnecting with the divine. Religio, to draw near to that unity, to that sacred being. So, there were no boundaries. Oh, this is culture, this is economy, this is. No, everything was sacred. All of life in Egypt was Socratic. Thebes, which was a very curious city, had on one side the city of the living, and on the other, the city of the dead, where the tombs of the great kings and the great figures of history were located. It was an honor to be born, to live, and to die in Thebes. When someone committed a certain crime, worse than being sentenced to death was being expelled from Thebes. Because dying in Thebes ensured that your life would be Socratic. Blessed are those who are born in Thebes. Blessed are those who die in Thebes. Blessed are those who are born, blessed are those who die. It was an honor, because everything in Thebes was Socratic. It was preferable to die there than to be expelled. So, this reflects a bit of the Egyptian mindset, which is extremely difficult for us to understand. It was already hard for the Greeks to grasp. Imagine for us. It was no longer the same time. Pythagoras, who also received his education in Egypt, had to make an adaptation in order to live within the mindset of Magna Graecia, which was a complicated matter. No one understood what he was trying to convey. He had to make a painful and delicate adaptation of thought, because the Greeks were no longer capable of understanding. Imagine our civilization. So, Egypt. It is a world that will take us a long time to understand again. Kybalion. As I was telling you, the Kybalion is a compilation, a collection of maxims that were extracted both from Hermetic body, Asa body, meaning a collection, a set of Hermetic texts, as well as from the Emerald Tablet. Written in the form we know today, it was published in 1908. Anonymously, it should be noted. There is strong suspicion that behind it are some members of the Theosophical movement who had deep knowledge of this tradition. but no one knows who wrote this book. It is a commented compilation of the 7 Hermetic laws. A truly beautiful book, it must be said. In it, these teachings are translated into a language that is easier for us to understand, but the laws are exactly the same as those found in the original Hermetic tradition. Only the commentaries are from the 20th century. It is a book published in 1908, under the title, The Three Initiates, the supposed authors. Who the 3 were, or whether they were truly initiates, no one knows. But the fact is, it is an excellent book and well worth exploring. And it clearly distinguishes, using italics and regular font, what is original and what is commentary by the authors. The Kybalion, the word Kybalion is said to share the same root as the word Kabbalah, meaning tradition or transmission. And it reflects, to some extent, what this Hermetic wisdom was about. It was knowledge passed from mouth to ear, as I mentioned to you. Principles that are applicable both to human beings and to the universe. The Kybalion can be interpreted through an astronomical lens. It can also be interpreted psychologically. It can be interpreted using any key you can imagine. For example, bringing it closer to something more familiar to us, the 12 labors of Hercules. You know that there is a psychological key there, a remarkable path of self-knowledge. But you also know that the 12 labors of Hercules speak of the sun's journey through the 12 constellations of the zodiac. There is also a key related to tales of the soul's conquest of evil. And many others as well. Keys of interpretation, different possibilities. So, we usually narrow it down to the psychological aspect, which is what we are able to grasp. As I mentioned to you about that phrase, the lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. And now, let's move on to the laws. Let us now explore the 7 Hermetic principles. The first of them, quite well known, is the principle of mentalism. All is mind, the universe is mental. Clear, evident, and undeniably aligned with Plato's theory of ideas. There's really nothing to argue about. Plato was inspired by Egypt, and he didn't even try to hide it. He drew inspiration from Egypt. When he says, for example, no one makes a chair like the one you're sitting on without first thinking of it. Imagine if the carpenter had just tripped over the wood, and the wood randomly arranged itself into a chair. That would be madness. Anyone would think that's crazy. Insane. In fact, there's a contemporary thinker, Fritz Socratic, who wrote an interesting book where he talks about the holographic universe. He speaks precisely about the impossibility of things coming into existence chaotically in the world, without first originating from a mental plane, from the realm of universal ideas. He gives an example that I find absolutely hilarious. He tells you to throw your computer down the stairs. And the computer goes bouncing down the steps. And let's say you had an old model. Help me out here, give me the name of an old model and a new one, because I don't know. You had a Pentium. Then, due to the randomness of the computer falling down the stairs, it somehow rearranged itself internally in such a way that, when it reached the bottom, it turned into a latest generation Apple, a Macintosh. Of course, there would be a line of people waiting to throw their computers down those stairs. And you know that's not going to happen. That's ridiculous. Now, do you think the universe is less complex than a Macintosh? And that it undergoes changes toward increasingly complex states. Then he concludes in a way that I find very interesting, very profound, saying, look, our century will go down in history as one of the most dogmatized by the belief in chance. Things evolve in an orderly manner toward increasingly complex states. Evidently, this must be conceived on some level of planning. That evolution would be the realization, in the material world, of something that already existed in the realm of ideas. The cosmic mind that the Indians call Mahat. Evolution itself, you may have heard about this, comes from the Latin word evolvere. Evolvere was nothing more than unrolling scrolls to see what was written inside. Evolution would then be the unrolling of the scroll of the divine mind to discover what it had envisioned for the universe. The more we evolve, the more we unroll the scroll of the human condition to see what is written there, and well through the world. So, in truth, everything would originate from this mental plane. And it would project itself into the world, and to evolve would be to pursue that archetype, that model, which has existed in the realm of ideas since the beginning of time. The model of the human condition would exist even if there were not a single human being in the world. the idea of man would exist. And it is fulfilled as man builds a bridge between heaven and earth. This is the idea of the pontiff, the priest, his head in the heavens and his feet on the earth. He perceives these ideas and begins to manifest them within himself. And thus begins the process of evolution, and as he evolves, everything around him evolves as well. Because his works reflect his bearing, his stature, his size as a human being. If man does not evolve, it's no use, nothing else will evolve either. Things may become more modern in a utilitarian sense, but not more deeply understood. We will have more know-how to do things, but well know why. So, this is the idea of mentalism. Continuing a bit further with it, universe itself would be a creation of the mind, of the all. This vast discussion that exists today within astronomy, the universe is in a process of expansion. At a certain point, will it stop expanding and begin to contract, or will it not? Will it continue expanding indefinitely? Everything was within that horizon, that initial singularity. Then came the Big Bang, which, in fact, is no longer referred to as the Big Bang, it's just called the Big. Inflation, the universe inflated within a certain span of time, and it expanded and continues to expand. Later, will it shrink again? Well, if you consider the Pythagorean decade, Pythagoras is remembered, for example, in India as Yavna-Sharia. He passed through India and is also remembered in Egypt. Pythagoras says that everything comes from 0 and moves toward 1, and then everything returns from 1 back to 0, which is the number 10. In other words, things expand and then contract. It is the heartbeat of the cosmos. This is interesting because it is one of the deepest concepts found, for example, within the Indian tradition. To say that what most resembles the universe within us is our heart, with its systoles and diastoles. It expands and contracts, expands and contracts. The universe would be like that. Isn't that curious? Isn't that interesting? So, the universe had its purpose, its idea, in the realm of ideas, in the divine mind, even before a single molecule, a single atom, had manifested. Understanding this principle enables an individual to readily grasp the laws of the mental universe and apply the same principle for their own happiness and progress. How would that work? Within philosophy, in practice, inner life is the control of the mind. What does that mean in practical terms? If everything that is to be already exists in the mental plane of nature, and nature brings it into being, then doesn't everything that will happen in our lives also originate in our own mental plane? You've probably heard of Eastern medicine, for example, which says that illnesses originate from mental forms. Certain illnesses that, for instance, lead to the decomposition of the body would be born from hatred, which decomposes, or from selfishness. Heart problems might arise from certain grudges or resentments. In other words, Indian medicine, for example, speaks of this constantly. In other words, our mental patterns, if you feed them, will create openings through which they can manifest as events in your life. And if you don't want these events to unfold, repeat themselves, or take root, then you must change your mental patterns. Don't believe that only physical actions bring about consequences. The mind generates consequences that are just as real or even more softened purely physical actions. Merely accidental actions do not generate as many consequences as a mental pattern that you continuously feed over a reasonable period of time. It affects both you and the world around you. We are constantly being influenced by mental forms that are floating around within humanity. To such an extent that, if we don't have a clear sense of identity to discern what is truly ours and what is not, we end up being thought by others, rather than thinking for ourselves. Just as the universe is born from the mental plane, your own universe is also born from it. Your life, too, is born from there. So take care of what you think, for it will shape your future. Everything that will be begins now in the mental plane. This is the first Hermetic principle. Imagine how many dimensions I'm simplifying, but how many dimensions could this be applied to? This? The second principle is the principle of correspondence. This is a constant. You find this law manifested in every tradition you can imagine. And it says the following: what is above is like what is below. And what is below is like what is above. According to the Hermetic tradition, it is not identical, but it is similar. It corresponds symbolically. What exists in the micro also exists in the macro. The universe has correspondences on all planes. Isn't that interesting? Do you remember that staff, the staff of the god Mercury that we saw at the beginning? It says the following: when you observe that a human being is made up of a physical body, a psychic body, and a spiritual body, when you observe certain laws in nature, see how they operate, and extract the meaning behind those laws, you can apply them to any other plane, and they will work there as well. But you see, Plato talks about this. In everything that works well, you can extract a general law that you could apply anywhere else. In everything that goes wrong, you can identify a mistake that violated a fundamental law that could not be digested. For example, I could tell you that Newton's laws that every action generates an equal and opposite reaction apply on the psychological and spiritual planes as well, and these are the laws of karma. Your thoughts also generate this kind of return. Your emotions also generate this kind of return. A law that is abstracted from a situation in one plane finds similarity in any other. In other words, when I uncover a mystery of nature, I uncover it on multiple levels, because it applies everywhere. Let me tell you a little silly story. I love silly little stories, because they're usually the ones we remember the most. The sillier they are, the easier they are to memorize. We are volunteers, as you know, at New Acropolis. And most of the centers which belong to us, we helped build ourselves. We have a center there in Lago Norte, and we worked on it from the very beginning, from digging the foundations. When it came time to work on the walls, to apply the plaster, we had 2 or 3 bricklayers who were working and laughing at us. Taking turns, laughing more than working at times, while we, a large group of volunteers, stood around trying to imitate what they were doing. Plastering walls. It's an initiatory experience, my friends, you know that. You throw that mortar at the wall, poof, it falls straight to the ground. And it seems impossible to make it stick. Then the bricklayer comes along, poof, it sticks. That was a major challenge, a deep trauma in my life, one I'm still working through with Freudian psychoanalysis to heal. I would watch the bricklayer laugh at me and throw the mortar, and it would stick to the wall. I'd throw it, poof, plop, poof, plop, poof, plop, until one moment, I focused and just kept watching him. I observed the distance he kept from the wall, the amount of mortar he used in that spot, the force he applied. I memorized everything, stored it all, took mental notes: distance, amount of mortar, momentum, distance from the wall, everything. Poof, would you believe it? It stuck. I celebrated with champagne. Of course, I didn't go on to do more of that work. Clearly, I wasn't cut out for it. But you see, in a situation like that, a bricklayer will always, eternally, be better than me at plastering a wall. But that experience taught me lessons that applied to many areas of my life. For example, once, I was talking to someone who was going through an emotional crisis and was very distressed. And I just listened and waited. I knew I had to let them vent a little so they could calm down. But I couldn't say too much, because if I did, would get too caught up in their mental patterns, and they wouldn't hear me anymore. So, it had to be the right moment to step in. I had to say something that would shift their mental cycle, but not so much that it would shock them. It had to be a part of the truth, not too much of it, and not too little either, because otherwise it would have no effect at all. I couldn't speak harshly, because she would get hurt, but I had to speak with firmness. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any credibility. So I found the right amount, the right intensity, the right moment. Poof, it stuck. Phew. See, from that I can draw insights from my entire life. A philosopher can do that, take a principle from a simple situation. You realize that what we call technicians or specialists in today's society know only a single application, the one they were technically trained for. But they don't understand the universal principle from that which would allow them to live better through it. That is the realm of philosophers. A bricklayer will always plaster a wall better than I will. And many other professions will know how to apply practical principles better than we do. But a philosopher learns from those principles even to relate at home, in traffic. Even to relate to oneself, Iona. They extract laws that, from a single situation, can be applied to relationships. You know that intelligence is the art of making connections. An intelligent person makes connections. Iona. We have become exclusivists, specialists. We have lost the ability to make connections. Intelligence is a very rare attribute in our historical world. It requires practice, it requires training. Intelligence is the great art of relationships. When you learn something deeply, it serves for everything, doesn't it? That is the principle of correspondence. Look, I told you it appears very frequently. If you take, for example, the principle of the school, the Temple of Delphi, in Greece. Man, know yourself and you will know the universe and the gods. Isn't it the same thing? The principle of correspondence, what is above and below? And Plato's principle, that man is a microcosm within the macrocosm? Isn't it the same thing? And if you take, for example, the biblical principle that God made man in his image and likeness? The same thing. I often speak about the Kabbalistic principle, which is also interesting, that the name of God, Yahweh, represents, if you place it vertically, the head, torso, and limbs of a human being. In other words, man is the name of God projected into space-time. Do you see that it's the same idea replicated everywhere? It's impossible that so many different peoples conspired together to deceive us. Or could it be possible? For him, there must be a truth of the universe that we can recover. This is the principle of correspondence. The third principle, this one, is beautifulous vibration. Heraclitus, back in Greece, spoke of something very similar, much later. Nothing is fixed, nothing is still, everything moves, everything vibrates. We make a quartz watch, and it works because quartz vibrates. Anyone who works in construction knows they must take into account the expansion and contraction of the materials in their building. Everything vibrates, and it is said that the universe, have you ever heard of something called the inner name? The inner name, a concept often used in more traditional civilizations, refers to the level of vibration of your consciousness. It is who you truly are. Imagine, for example, when a motorcycle turns the key and makes that familiar and pleasant sound. Then it fades away, right? So, it disappears, it leaves our auditory spectrum, it goes beyond the range of vibration we can perceive. The same happens with light. There is a certain range of vibration that we can no longer see, but it still exists. The universe, the inner name of things, relates to the vibrational parameter they possess. According to the Egyptian tradition, it goes something like this. If you take matter and accelerate it, you get energy. If you accelerate it further, you get light. If you continue accelerating, you reach what they called mystery, the unknown. If you accelerate further, you reach spirit. If you accelerate even more, you reach God. The universe is measured by the vibrational level at which it exists. Your consciousness vibrates at a certain frequency. It can be accelerated, or it can be slowed down. Your inner name is the level of vibration at which your consciousness resides. Because dense matter vibrates so slowly that it appears to be still. Spirit vibrates so rapidly that it also appears to be still. These are the two extremes. And to accelerate a being is simply to raise their vibrational level. You've probably heard of Plato, for example, in his Republic, where he envisioned an ideal city. He said, "Be careful with the music that the government gives to the people." Do you know why? He even said, "I can know a state by the music its rulers give to the people, because music is a pure vibrational pattern. And it has the ability to tune you to its own vibrational frequency." Don't think that anything in our lives goes without consequence. A person who is used to listening to music with very coarse, very aggressive vibrations and says, "But that has nothing to do with my life. I'm a person of principles, I just like this kind of music." Forget it. At some point, when faced with a challenge in life, your consciousness will gravitate toward the vibrational pattern it resonates with. That's why Plato spoke of music as a fundamental element of education. There was a philosopher from the last century, Sri Ram, who said that evolution is nothing more than the refinement of taste. Be mindful of the things that pull your consciousness toward coarser vibrations. That doesn't go unpunished. Nothing in life goes unpunished. Evolution is an acceleration of vibration. To vibrate more and more in tune with subtler, nobler, more celestial, more spiritual things. To accelerate your vibration is to grow. The inner name of each being is the vibrational level at which they exist. Mantras sought to reproduce this. For example, in India, when they wanted to speak the names of the gods, the mantras would reproduce the vibrational pattern of the gods' names. It is said that this wasn't for just anyone, only a Brahmin was capable of doing it. That's how it was, because today we no longer have that. So, this is the principle of vibration. All thoughts, all emotions, or mental states have their own degree and mode of vibration. And to evolve would be to accelerate. And then to seek things with more subtle vibrations and attune yourself to them. Take care of what nourishes your soul, just as you care for what nourishes your body. No one believes that eating rotten food comes without consequences. Consuming something with a very coarse vibration on the mental and emotional planes also does not come without consequences. Nothing is without consequence. Everything generates consequences. We'll see this again shortly in another principle. The fourth principle, polarity. The expression of this principle is beautiful, challenging, complex, but very beautiful. Everything is dual. Everything has two poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. The similar and the dissimilar are one and the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are half-truths. All paradoxes can be reconciled. Beautiful, isn't it? But what does that really mean? Imagine the following: something simple, like a thermometer. If you look at a temperature gradient, hot and cold are identical in nature, but different in degree. Isn't that right? It's hard to pinpoint on a thermometer where heat begins and cold ends. You need to establish a reference point. What would that be? The human body temperature 36.5 degrees Celsius is considered ideal. Above that is hot, below that is cold. Because when you look at the temperature gradient as a whole, there's no hot or cold. They are simply different degrees of a single reality, which is temperature. And when things share the same nature, the same substance, and differ only in degree, it's not difficult to transform one into the other. You can't transform things that are fundamentally different, but things of the same nature can be reversed. For example, laziness can be turned into drive, into action. Criticism into discernment, hatred into love. They are things of the same nature, simply varying in degrees, in gradients, in different levels of vibration. And when they exist within the same gradient, you can reverse them. Just like an antipyretic reduces the temperature of someone with a fever. There is a kind of knowledge that can generate in a person what is called neutralization. We'll explore that in just a moment. Things of the same class can be transmuted into one another. It is possible, for example, to change vibrations of hatred into vibrations of love. It's interesting that I often say these vibrations. We'll soon see this in the principle of polarity. We are quite familiar in society with these oscillations from one vibration to another. But a state of neutrality that places us on a higher level is rare. In general, it is not well known. We'll understand this a bit better, for example, within the principle of rhythm. How can I transform hatred into true love and not into passion? Because turning it into passion is easy, you know. All the soap operas on Read Globo know how to do hermetic principles. Everyone starts off hating each other and ends up together. With passion, it's easy. But with true love, there's a bit more complexity, yet it is possible. It is possible. And the next principle which you'll see is interconnected with all the others. We'll speak a lot about this. It is the principle of rhythm. Everything has a flow and a return. Everything has its tides. Everything rises and falls. Everything manifests through balanced oscillations. The measure of movement to the right is the measure of movement to the left. Rhythm is compensation. My grandmother, who was a rather interesting lady, simple, yet with a kind of life wisdom I found fascinating, probably never even heard that someone named Hermes Trismegistus existed in the world. I'm not even sure she knew Egypt existed. But the fact is, she used to say something very insightful: a day full of laughter is the eve of little wisdom. Do you remember that popular saying? We were all hysterical, a bunch of wild kids, and she would say, "Child, tomorrow you'll be crying." And I didn't understand a thing. What madness? What does one thing have to do with the other? And then you realize that there really is this gradient between euphoria and depression. If you swing too far in one direction, you'll swing just as far in the other. As a form of compensation. The soap operas on Read Globo, as I've mentioned to you, are experts at this. I noticed, for example, a couple who, during the dating phase, displayed very explosive behavior with loud demonstrations of passion. He arrives in a helicopter and throws down little flyers. I love you, my darling. This gradient of euphoria can turn into a gradient, for example, of aggression or rejection within a marriage. It's rare to find a couple who were very serene and later ended up slapping each other. Serenity represents a gradient of small deviation. Deviation, on the other hand, tends to remain small. Things balance out. It's a mathematical law of nature. So, this principle of rhythm tells us something very similar to Newton's laws. Equal intensity, but in the opposite direction. Deviations tend to balance themselves out. So, when it comes to a man who harbors hatred, the solution wouldn't be to generate passion. Because that passion, by the next day, is likely to turn back into hatred. Have you ever noticed that sometimes, when people joke around or laugh, and the jokes are a bit vulgar, creating a kind of euphoria? You can feel that, in the end, there's a lingering sense of bitterness. At the end of the party, do you already have a bitter taste in your mouth? That's the counterpart. It's the principle of polarity. The next time you feel that, you can say, Hermes Trismegistus. Everyone will look at you and ask, who is Hermes Trismegistus? And in that moment, you will have understood a part of this mystery. Polarities balance each other out. So, to overcome hatred, the answer isn't passion, it's love. But love cannot remain halfway along the path. Do you know why? If you pulled a pendulum to the middle of the path, look here, a pendulum just fell here for me. A sign. A pendulum in the middle of the path is still very, let's say, vulnerable. It will start swinging again. You have to reach the true balance point, the one that doesn't swing. You have to rise. To develop true love, the kind that doesn't waver, you have to go higher. It forms a triangle. Very similar to what you set up at Christmas in your home, in the nativity scene. On one side, there's the little donkey, representing inertia. On the other side, the ox or the bull, representing passion. And there, above the manger, Trismegistus symbolizing balance and serenity. In other words, balance is achieved on a higher level. It is drawn upward. This is what they call the principle of neutrality, which is a sub-principle within the law of rhythm. Rhythm is inexorable. But we can find a point of stability that lifts us out of these fluctuations. If you believe that there were men who truly loved humanity, whether it's Christ for Christians, Trismegistus, or the Buddha for Buddhists, so many beings who became part of human history. If these men loved humanity, which is likely, how did their love manifest itself? Wasn't it serene, sober, and enduring? Wasn't it a love that came from above, from the center, from the balance point? Or have you ever seen a great master of wisdom say, I love you, humanity, while throwing pamphlets from a helicopter? It is sober, enduring, profound, self-assured, free from fluctuations, and without contradictions. In other words, it aligns with the center of the scale. There's no way to eliminate fluctuations entirely, but we can minimize their influence on us. That's what we call neutralization. We'll soon see how that works. The principle of compensation, without excess. These two little ones here demonstrate that. The little boy and the little girl, right? They're fighting over the teddy bear. Then you step in, and you try to mediate the fight. But how are you going to mediate this fight? If you also want the teddy bear for yourself, you'll just become a third person fighting over the teddy bear. You won't be mediating anything. But if you've overcome your desires, if you've moved beyond that need for experience, if you are a mature and balanced adult, you've stepped up a level. You've neutralized the desires of that stage, and now you can bring harmony to what's happening below. Do you understand this idea? In other words, I no longer desire the teddy bear. I've transcended that experience. So, my consciousness has moved up to the next level. Now I can bring balance to the fluctuations happening below, if I have transcended it. Now, if all my need for experience is still at that level, if I'm a child, then I'll be caught in that conflict. I'll become a third force fighting over the teddy bear. This is the principle of neutralization. There is only one way to neutralize the conflicts of a given level. Because these conflicts, this oscillation, are part of the law. You cannot cancel the law. But you can place yourself on a higher level, so that you are no longer affected by that law at that level. There will be other laws at this new level. So, you keep rising and neutralizing, until no desire can reach you, until you arrive at wisdom. Neutralization means growing in order to master the forces that are affecting you at that level. to move to another level of consciousness. Neutralization means, there is nothing here that I desire anymore. So, overcoming a certain level of experience allows you to reconcile these conflicts. On one occasion, we had a teacher passed away about 5 years ago who brought new Acropolis to Brazil, Professor Michel Echenique. He used to say something very interesting, that nature, the Earth's geography, has peaks and valleys. But up above, there is a sun that, at least from our point of view, remains constant. It doesn't fluctuate, it stays still up there, observing the Earth's geography. And your consciousness has something of the sun and something of the Earth. If you identify with the Earth, there's no way around it, you'll keep going up and down, experiencing peaks and valleys. But if you identify with that which is solar within you, your body will still go through ups and downs. And you no longer identify with that. You know that person who wakes up in the morning and says, "Look, my body is worn out today, but I'm doing well. My psyche is a mess today, but I'm doing well." In other words, down there. And when you don't give too much attention to those vibrations, they start to become gentler. Like a child. Have you ever seen a child throwing a tantrum and you just look at them? Does it get better or worse? Much worse. That's when the scene really gets dramatic. But if you pretend you're not listening, they go all Fernando Pessoa. It's not effective, it's not working. So you recognize things from above, and down here Fernando Pessoa the oscillations go. Now, let's move on to the sixth principle. Cause and effect. Cause and effect is typically the law of karma, which, in a certain way, is related to the principle of polarity we just discussed. The law of karma, which in India is more or less defined in the same terms, says the following: every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. All things happen in accordance with the law. Chance is simply a name given to a law not yet recognized. There are many planes of causality, but nothing escapes the law. In other words, if you want to change the future, generate different causes now. Helena Blavatsky used to say, there's no point in asking the gods to spare you from the consequences of causes you've already set in motion. Because if there are gods, they became great by respecting the laws of nature, and not even they can go against causality. Now, the simplest of beings can change the causes so they won't suffer the same consequences again. In the realm of causes, we all have power. In the realm of consequences, we no longer do. What does the Christian Bible say about this? Sowing is free, but the harvest is mandatory. Isn't that right? If you planted wheat, don't cry at harvest time because you wanted soybeans. It's wheat. Now, you are free to plant whatever you want in the next sowing. In the field of causes, we are free. In the field of consequences, we are conditioned. Iona. And if we understand this, we gain a sense of freedom and autonomy. Because we are free to generate causes whose consequences are those we dream of for our future. And we can begin to close loops in our lives. This is very interesting. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. At a certain point in life, when you're going through a difficult situation, you remember it perfectly. You remember the exact moment when you created the need for that experience. What was your attitude? What was the stubbornness? What was the resistance? What was your stance toward life, whose consequence is what you are living now? And realize that you asked to go through that in order to grow. So the blame is no one else sees you. Don't shift the blame to others, not to third parties, fourth or fifth. You are living that experience. There is no blame, in fact. You are going through it as a pedagogical process. As a consequence of that attitude. Epictetus, a Roman philosopher, said that the extinction of blame marks the beginning of moral progress. In other words, things are a natural consequence of the causes you freely created. Brother, everything follows a chain, right? Every idea, every thought, every feeling generates effects. And then there's this quote from Ernst that's quite interesting. Given the same causes, the same results will follow. I want my life to change. And what do you keep doing? The same thing. What will the consequence be? The same. Every year, on New Year's, that lovely little New Year's Eve, we toast, well, see our plans for the year. And we keep acting the same way as in the old year. You want to achieve your goals that way. You didn't generate causes. You didn't act upon the causes. You created a superstitious faith in consequences that fall from nowhere. Which is the idea of luck that we have. What do you mean by luck? We truly believe that rabbits come out of hats. If you didn't put a rabbit in there beforehand. That's fanatical, that's childish. Rabbits come out. Where did you put the rabbits? When are you putting the rabbit in? So, evidently, with the same causes, the same effects will follow. And finally, to conclude, the seventh Hermetic principle, which is the principle of gender. Gender comes from generare, and gerarto generate, and to give birth, which brings everything into existence across the three planes of the universe. Gender is present in everything. Everything contains both masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. Gender is not about sex, folks. Gender becomes sex when it is projected onto the physical body of human beings or animals. Gender can exist on the emotional plane. Gender can exist on the mental plane. Two ideas combine and generate a consequence. Two emotions combine and generate a consequence. Yin and Yang, the Tao, are demonstrations of the principle of gender. Everything that is generated or created happens in this way. It explains that gender means to generate on the physical plane, to procreate on the mental plane, or to create on the spiritual plane. The principle of gender allows you to be original, to receive new ideas on the spiritual plane. It allows for the generation of new combinations of old ideas on the mental plane. And it allows for the generation of new physical bodies on the physical plane. But no one creates anything new unless they know how to make use of the principle of gender. And we only know its physical application. No creation is possible without this principle. Here, Isis, Osiris, and Horus are a demonstration of the principle of gender. Now, it's interesting. The principle of gender here reminds us a bit of mentalism, doesn't it? On the mental plane, we truly generate much of what we are going to experience. Now, it's very interesting when he talks about mental gender. Did you know that your mind has both masculine and feminine aspects? And that if you want to create something new, you need to be aware of this. He uses the example of the cuckoo's egg. Have you ever heard that this bird has a strange, yet clever habit of going into other birds' nests, pushing out all the existing eggs, and laying its own? The other birds then incubate the cuckoo's egg, and when that very odd-looking chick hatches, the birds don't understand how it happened. They end up incubating another bird's egg. It's a clever trick. In fact, it's said that man is a syntax of nature. Everything that happens somewhere in nature also happens within the human being. It's as if he were a product. Teilhard de Chardin speaks a lot about this. A product, a syntax of everything nature has developed up to this point. Nature synthesizes all of that in the creation of the human being. So, imagine the following. An idea suddenly appears in your mind, a flash poof. Then you take that idea and begin to nurture it, develop it, work on it. And because you developed it, worked on it, you get the impression that you created it. You are the mother, it grew in your womb, but the element that fertilized it wasn't always yours. Sometimes it was an idea from the collective unconscious, sometimes it was someone's subtle manipulation. Very subtly, it reaches you and plants a tiny little idea. Then you build a nest for it, nurture it, raise it, incubate it. Like a cuckoo's egg, it develops. And because you cared for it and gave birth to it, you have the impression, I'm the mother, this is my idea. But the fertilization came from external elements. Where did the idea come from? And gave rise to all of this? If I'm capable of going to the realm of ideas, to the spiritual plane, seeing some law of the universe and fertilizing my mind, then I'm incubating the cuckoo's egg. I am nurturing ideas that are not truly mine. This is what he refers to as the masculine mind and the feminine mind. Be careful. Which ideas have you not only developed, but actually received yourself? Which of your thoughts are truly your own? Which of your creations genuinely belong to you? This is the most common mechanism used for suggestion and manipulation. As if it were nothing. Poof, a little idea. Then you take that and build an entire development around it. And it feels like it's yours. But deep down, what you developed was the egg of another bird, a cuckoo's egg. And this is very common in society. You see many people with political opinions, with feelings of hatred towards some, admiration for others' public figures, and you realize that those feelings aren't truly theirs. There's no real reason for them to feel that way. They don't actually think like that. There's no personal reflection that gave rise to those ideas. They developed a thought that was instilled by the collective. You see? How few of our ideas are truly ours, how few of our feelings actually belong to us. Just two. A little anecdote, but one I find interesting and always remember. When I was a child, around 10 years old, I was already living here in Brasilia. One day I went to school, and when I got there, it was closed. There were no classes that day because someone had passed away, Juscelino Kubitschek. So I headed back home and ran into a classmate of mine from 5th grade along the way. He was coming along, all cheerful, and I said to him, "Hey, there won't be school today." He asked me, "Why not?" I said, "Well, because Juscelino Kubitschek died." The look on his face. He suddenly looked heartbroken. It was pure sorrow. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me and asked, was he in the 5th grade? Every time I see someone showing rejection, passion, or hatred toward public figures, I remember Juscelino from the 5th grade. People don't even know what they're talking about. They don't truly feel anything about it. We use emotions and thoughts as a form of entertainment. None of them are truly ours. They're just like whipped cream, just to add flavor to life. They don't belong to you. And feelings are not a game. If you treat feelings lightly, if you don't take them seriously, they'll always remain shallow emotions. What do you truly love? What truly causes you pain? What do you really think about other human beings? Have you reflected on that? Have you created that understanding? If not, then you've only had the feminine mind. The principle of generation hasn't taken effect yet. You haven't created anything. You haven't generated life. None of your ideas are truly your own. And because of that, you have no way to realize your identity, to deliver your message to the world, to declare why you are here. That only becomes possible when you create your own identity, when you fertilize your own mind. Do you understand this idea? To me, this became a symbol. Collective feelings and thoughts are like Juscelino in 5th grade. Because that's really how it is. We have very little that is truly authentic, very little that truly communicates to the world what we came here to express. Our true identity. And finally, there is a closing recommendation in the Kybalion that I find very beautiful. It is nothing more than that phrase by Helena Blavatsky, which says, "Honor the truths through practice." It says the following: beware of mental greed and express in action what you have learned. I'm referring to the axioms and aphorisms, but also to the Socratic ones. We will only access the wisdom of the all when we become integrated with it. Knowledge is like wealth, it is meant to be used. The law of use is universal, and whoever violates this law suffers due to their conflict with natural forces. In other words, knowledge brings commitment. If you don't want to commit to life, to humanity, to your own life, then don't seek knowledge. It's better not to. It's better not to know. It's like imagining you know how to swim and you walk past a pool where someone is drowning. Are you responsible for helping that person? If you don't know how to swim, then no. There would be 2 people drowning, it makes no sense. Knowledge brings commitment. And if you seek knowledge, you must also seek commitment. Because that is the only true meaning. Knowledge without commitment is vanity. And you never truly know something until you commit to it and live it. This is the foundation, the ultimate principle, so to speak, the warning that Hermes Trismegistus leaves for future generations. Beware of not living what you know. Honor the truths through practice. Well, basically, as I mentioned to you, these are the elements for you to get a general understanding of what this is about. These 7 little phrases. According to Hermes Trismegistus, they organize the manifested universe. And a deep understanding of them would allow us to comprehend the universal laws with which we interact in what we call life. Because the universe is entirely interconnected by laws, fully connected through logic, entirely organized by intelligence. There is no chaos in the universe, nor is it desirable. There was a mathematician, Henri de Poincaré, who said that chance is nothing more than the measure of our ignorance. This is also very hermetic. What we do not understand, we call chance. But there are laws at work there that we have not yet discovered. As we come to understand them, we commit ourselves to them. Well, that's basically it. I remind you that Egypt is one of the subjects we study right at the first level of our philosophy course. We are a volunteer-based organization, and New Acropolis is committed to sharing a philosophy that is experiential and practical. So, the idea is that all of our lectures serve as a small sample of what we develop within our philosophy course. Those who are not yet familiar will have the opportunity to explore Egypt in more depth right at the first level in the ethics module. Egyptian ethics is truly fascinating, and it greatly helps us to understand the true spirit of ethics, understanding how the Egyptians thought. I invite you all to remember that we have a new class opening this week, on Wednesday and Thursday. Class openings are fairly spaced out, so don't miss this opportunity to come and get to know you, especially those who are not yet with us. You should attend a first class, have the experience for yourself. Every philosopher has a love for knowledge, even just to understand what it's all about. I'm certain that anyone who enjoys a lecture like this one, on a Friday evening, has the potential for philosophy. Come and discover it for yourselves. That's it. We'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
Mentioned regarding the issue of certain weaknesses. There are things that often bring us down. Also, the attention we give to those things. Like that example of the child fighting. If you come down to their level, you'll end up stepping in and pulling the teddy bear too. But, for example, if everything is created by us, I believe in that as well. But we still haven't discovered what exactly is creating it because of the situation. But, for example, if I'm affected by a migraine, for instance, and it brings me down, and I struggle to get out of that state, is it because I'm giving it too much attention to that or not, you know? I'm giving a very physical example, but it applies to anything else that is bringing you down.
Yeah, each case is unique. When you're dealing with a physical ailment, like a migraine, which is an intense pain, during the migraine itself, there's not much room for philosophy. It's really about taking care of yourself. But once you're out of it, outside the migraine cycle, you can try to understand what the triggers are that lead you to certain mental states that develop the symptoms. I know several people who suffer from migraines, and some of them have already come to that conclusion. That certain mental states, certain emotions, are connected. So, a trigger and then the migraine. I've learned how to deal with it. When I feel it starting to come on, I shift my focus. Because if we believe that most physical ailments have a psychological origin, and even science acknowledges this today, with psychosomatic illnesses, then sometimes we can spare ourselves from many things and even navigate unpleasant situations without resorting to medication. Ayurvedic medicine in India specializes in this. And when it comes to the psychic level, even more so. These emotional patterns arise every time I encounter a certain obstacle, because I don't know how to deal with that obstacle. And the response is always the same. In the midst of a crisis, the goal is to survive. If you're in a state of rage, you're not going to engage in philosophy. But tomorrow, when the anger subsides, reflect on why that particular thing triggered your anger. And learn to develop a more appropriate response in that situation. Begin to identify the triggers. Because, in truth, you say, I don't know why we go through certain experiences. According to Hermeticism, it's very simple. We go through certain experiences because we need them in order to grow. You called these events into your life. Because by living them, you can grow. These events are an external representation of something you need to see within yourself. If you make that synthesis, you often overcome it. In the medicine of Serapis, after Gaius Laelius in Greece, everyone would sleep in the temple of Serapis, and they would dream of the causes of their illness. If you don't go to the root causes, there's no point in acting on the effects. Those causes will break through somewhere else, and they will generate another illness, because they need to manifest. Were you going to ask something?
What was the title of the Arabic book?
Yes, do in Portuguese. It's called A Bentafale. A Bentafale, which is called the Self-Taught Philosopher. It's a curious little story. It tells how a man reaches a mystical level of seeing God, starting from the observation of nature. Of course, it's not as simple as the book portrays. What it shows happening in a single lifetime is, well, something. A bit long, but the process is very intelligent. I believe it's possible, and it's in human nature, through life's events, to reach the highest level of consciousness that a human being can attain. It's a beautiful book, truly fascinating. I like to mention these works so you can see that philosophy, the love of wisdom, has been with humanity throughout all times and in all places. This is an Arabic book from the 12th century. Very, very beautiful. Go ahead.
Feminine and masculine, but how can there be a relationship with inauthentic feelings and thoughts?
Inauthentic thoughts and feelings are those where someone else came and planted the seed. The seed is not yours. You worked on its development, nurtured it, fertilized it, and when the plant grows, you say, "It's my child."
But you weren't the one who planted the seed there. The masculine is the seed, both on the mental plane and the astral plane. It is the seed. And the feminine is the womb that develops, gives life, nourishes, and brings light into the world. Who was it that planted the seed there? Sometimes, a person passes by you for just a few minutes and manages to infiltrate you. A bad feeling, a negative thought. Then you spend 2 or 3 days processing it, without realizing it all started from that tiny spark. Sometimes it's just a small criticism, a little bit of malice. Did you see that thing? That's it, nothing more is said. Just did you see that thing? And you spend a whole week feeling angry. Have you ever experienced that? A seed. And it was me. It wasn't you. You only fed it. The seed wasn't yours.
There are theorists who say that our civilization is going through a neurotic model of relationship with the psychotic, where the law depends on perspective and on what connects us.
I think that's quite likely. Because we live in a time where everything tends to be relativized. Today, it's very difficult to talk about certain things like these without someone saying, "That's just how the Egyptians thought," or "That's relative, that doesn't mean anything to me." The lack of knowledge of universal laws, of general principles, and the tendency to interpret everything through subjectivity makes it impossible for human beings to learn from the past. So we study the past to build airplanes, to build cars, to build buildings, but not to build human beings. We believe we can do that on our own. And that what is good for Hermes, who speaks to me, is not necessarily good for me. Everything is relative. I was telling my students the other day, right here by the lake, that once someone attended a lecture. It was one of my lectures, where I spoke about the virtues of the hero, and the person said, "Look, those virtues are very relative. Even the law of gravity is relative near a black hole." I believe that, but I'm not a black hole, I'm a human being. The law of gravity is quite absolute. For me, if I throw myself out the window, I'll find out. So, men, that is what you are, as Chaplin once said. So, as human beings, there are laws that are universal for us. Just as the principles of aerodynamics apply to a spacecraft or a car, the Hermetic principles apply to a human being. These are the principles that help shape the human being. Jung has a very interesting quote where he talks about this. He says it's easier to start from scratch and build a spacecraft that takes you to the moon. Because starting from scratch means building a knowledge that takes you into your own inner self. An excessive relativization of human values. Everyone wants to learn everything. To fix a television, you take a technical course. To build a device, you go to college. But to build your own life, a 12-year-old boy thinks he knows everything and won't take advice from anyone. Isn't that right? Everything is relative. It's very complicated, very complex to build anything truly human, because every human being has to start from zero. It's as if every day you woke up with amnesia and had to build your life within a single day, without taking into account everything you had lived before. It's as if our generations were like that. They all wake up with amnesia and always start from scratch. And we come across certain elements where perhaps there is already life experience that could be inherited. And yet we always begin with amnesia. Everything starts at zero, like animality, like brutality, which we should have already taken into account. And yet we always remain at the same point. That is a fact. We are almost living in a schizophrenic society. Everything revolves around itself, and everything is done to serve the individual. Everything is about the personal. Everything is personal. Nothing is universal. We are not capable of seeing anything that refers to humanity as a whole. Everything is personal. This is an eccentricity, as if it were the principle of polarity, the loss of the center. An eccentricity that keeps growing. The pendulum swings so far that it loses contact with the center. It's a kind of almost collective pathology in our world.
Do you see this as something orchestrated?
No, I see it as a necessary experience for human beings. They're going to have to suffer a little. Nietzsche, in a book called The Genealogy of Morals, says that nature has only two ways to make you learn something. Through reflection, which you can choose, but if you don't, then through pain. Pain is a way of branding into you, with fire and iron, the truths of nature that you refuse to see. The need for human experience is what writes history. If one needs to live through a very crude materialism, then they will have to go through it. How can we prevent it? Those who are a bit more mature sometimes notice this when it comes to their children. The mother arrives with her daughter at a party. The daughter hasn't even entered the party yet. She looks and says, "My daughter is going to be interested in that young man over there, and she's going to be in trouble." She doesn't even get out of the car. She perceives, through her understanding of human nature, which is predictable, the mistakes, so to speak, that her daughter is going to make. But no wise person, when looking at humanity, should say that. And with these preferences, with this selfishness, because selfishness is something that makes a person very predictable. It's like a little dog chasing its own tail. Selfishness makes a person predictable. They will pursue personal gain. Until the personality dissolves, they will keep chasing after personal benefits. As long as we remain stuck in that, without moving to a higher level of interest, without neutralizing it, without stepping up to a new stage, it's more or less predictable what we will experience. It is the law of human nature in order to evolve. It depends on when each of us chooses to unroll that scroll.
Interesting, it regresses first. Then it progresses. It's something that doesn't seem very logical.
It's in quotation marks. You have to understand that we shouldn't be either pessimistic or optimistic, right? Imagine a large sine wave. I swear, I swear, I swear, I swear, I swear. If you take the lowest point now and compare it to the lowest point back then, it seems like it's risen a little. But the problem is that we're at the low point. Now, be careful not to assume that everything I don't know, Egypt had wise and wonderful people. Do you think everyone living in Egypt was wise? Greece had Socrates and Plato. Do you think everyone was a Socrates or a Plato? If that were the case, would they have killed Socrates? So, when we learn a bit of history, we realize there was a level of barbarism, and that, on average, we've grown a little. But the process of growth is slow. Do you grow quickly? Do I grow? No one grows quickly. Growing as a human being is a slow process. And so, there's a certain patience we must have with human beings and with humanity, because it's a very slow sine wave. If you take, on average, 3,000 years of low points, there was Attila, throwing little children into wells for the wolves to devour. Does anyone still do that today? Yes, there are some, but it's not everyone. Most people would be outraged. It's already morally condemnable. Back then, it wasn't. If it was the enemy's child, you had to throw them to the wolves. Didn't it? As a whole, wouldn't humanity back then be unshaken by that? But it's kind of like that. We grow at the same pace as our development. But we cannot give up on growing. Do you understand? It's good, from time to time, to read great historical novelists. Christian Jack himself is like that. Stephen Pressfield has a beautiful book called Tides of War, where he tells what Greece was like in the time of Socrates. Folks, it was tough. Don't think that everyone in Greece was wise. There were wise people, but not that many. We've already gone through very difficult times. The key is to consider that with a certain clarity, not too extreme in either direction. We've made progress, but just a little. It's slow.
It was hard to think. They are blinding our eyes. Variety, crossing over, we end up seeing that. We end up seeing only the regrettable side of humanity.
Certainly, because even our indignation is already a positive sign. There probably weren't that many people who were outraged when Socrates drank the hemlock. Today, there's a significant portion of humanity outraged by the Islamic State, for example. That's how it is. We must be patient with ourselves and with humanity. We must believe in humanity, believe in ourselves, and never stop working. Because that's why we are here. That is our purpose on Earth. To work for our own growth and for the evolution of the world. Losing hope in humanity is the worst thing that can happen to a person. There's no chance for growth, and it doesn't help anyone else grow either. So, pessimism is a fallacy. Must be cautious with it. Any other questions, everyone?
I was thinking, after you spoke about the first principle. I don't know, it seems like it's the main one, and I started wondering if it's stronger than the others, as if it nourishes them.
Actually, in a certain way, you're right. Everything can be condensed within the mental framework, you see.
If I have, for example, a cause and effect, if I have a cause, I can foresee the consequence. And through the mind, I can change the consequence, because I've already foreseen it. So, is that really how it works?
Say more about what you mean. You'll see that if you read the book, they spend a good amount of time discussing this. The only way to understand that God, who was one, created the universe, is to see it as a mental creation, as something illusory. Because if he is the one, he couldn't create anything, because if he created nothing, there would be two. If he created something, there would be two, him and the other. And then he would no longer be one. The only way he could create anything is as a mental form within his own mind. Because then mental forms appear and disappear, just like things in the world. So, the entire reality of the manifested universe would be images within the divine mind, which the Indians call Mahat. Both the things themselves and the laws that govern them. It is a universe created with a purpose. It is not random, but it is entirely made of appearances. Reality is eternal. The fact that things are transient already proves that they are shadows, according to this tradition. Transience is a symptom of illusion. That which truly is cannot cease to be neither in time nor in space. So all other laws fit within this, all of it is happening within the mind of God. But in order for you to transcend it, it's like when you, as children, used to play Risk. I am getting a bit outdated, I don't know. Risk is a bunch of countries and territories you were playing, you were at war, but you realized that it's an illusion, you weren't actually at war with anyone. It's just a game. But in order to win the game, you have to follow its rules, otherwise, you won't emerge from it victorious. This is a game within the mind of God, but it's a game that has laws. If you want to overcome them, you must understand them and rise above them. You need to know how to fit within them and then transcend them. It's a game, but a game with order. A game within the mind of God. The great illusion is the myth of the cave. They are shadows. In a certain way, everything is already there. This is mental. The universe is mental. Then you come to realize how much your life is also mental. It arises from your mental attitudes toward the world. That's where you find the cause of all the consequences that manifest as events in your life. In mental forms you held at certain moments, which summon the necessity of that experience. Read a book, y'all enjoy it. It's very interesting. One of the best books I've ever read. The Kybalion, sensational, exactly.
It's that all these laws, in truth, one wouldn't function without the other. Iona.
Exactly. They are all interconnected and intertwined. You see how it's even difficult to explain rhythm without explaining polarity. In short, they are all bound together, and polarity gives rise to cause and effect. They are all interlinked. And everything is aligned within the mind of God. These are the principles by which divine thought operates. In truth, that's what it is, it's the logic of God. Because logic is not the foundation of human thought. These are the principles by which divine thought operates.
Bye. God would be a thread that connects and unites.
It's hard to know who originally said that, because it's found in the Vedas. It's the principle of the Sutratma. And the Vedas, well, they say they were written by Vyasa, but who can really know? The Vedas are a bit too ancient for us to know their true authorship. But it is a Vedic principle. It's a concept called Sutratma. Sutratma. It is the thread that runs through all the beads of the necklace. Any other questions, everyone? Well, I truly appreciate your presence, and I kindly ask that you don't leave without taking a little brochure with you so you can take a look at the full schedule, upcoming class openings, and future lectures. I'm always around here, every week. I assure you that you'll always find a good conversation here, and some interesting things as well. For a philosopher, there's nothing better than philosophy.